In this video, we're going to look at a different aspect of production, which is layout and backgrounds. Now, this wasn't intended to be a finished background piece for production, but what started as a concept sketch very quickly turned into a pretty resolved and detailed value sketch, which then moved into something where I started texturing it and painting it. But because I worked in layers and very specifically planned for After Effects, I was able to take this concept painting and eventually bring it into After Effects. So this is a really long video. It's about an hour long, and I didn't want to break this up too much because most of it is just me working at high speed. There's not a lot of real-time footage in here, but I do try to explain as much as possible what's going on while I'm doing it. If you guys do have questions and are interested in a more in-depth look, just let me know and I'll slow things down and you guys can look at a much longer version. So with that said, let's dive in and get through this thing. Okay, so I've started this drawing on top of a canvas texture. You can either just download one from the internet or create a pattern, however you want to work. And I've just drawn on this a really quick sketch of roughly what I'm thinking for the background. So what I've done now is I'm going to create a folder that has a color burn transfer on it. And then inside of that, I'm going to put a whole bunch of color masks that are varying shades of gray to create the layers that I want to work with to build this scene. Now, I'm working really fast. This is obviously sped up video, but this is a really fast way for me to work. And it also keeps me working in layers the way that I will have to think of the actual composition when I bring it into After Effects to create all the depth that I want to work with. The other benefit in working in this way is that it keeps me focused on composition. I'm not getting lost in any details. I'm not getting caught up in brush types or anything like that. I'm just working fast with like really big shapes and I'm focused on the layout of the actual environment that I'm painting. I will also have the ability to change the light and dark values of every layer on the fly, as you're seeing me do here. If I'm feeling like something isn't really quite reading or it's getting a little too heavy, it gives me the opportunity to change that right away and really easily without having to do a whole bunch of adjustments or anything like that. Now here you can see me adding trunks and bits of trees and everything like that. And I'm actually not drawing those with a paintbrush. I'm really just drawing on the alpha mask that's on the color layer. And this allows me to work non-destructively. So if you set your brush transfer to 0, I mean, it doesn't have to be 0, but I like to put it 100% opaque because eventually I'm going to use these as alpha masks to hold textures in. And so if you set your transfer to 0, so there's no transfer effects at all, and you can have all kinds of size dynamics you want, and then you just start painting on the layer, you literally start cutting holes into the alpha mask that's sitting on top of the color layer, and you can adjust it until it looks the way you want, and just go back and forth. And then what you can do is adjust the color or the value of that layer without losing any of your trees and without having to select anything special. One of the principles of painting environments is that the further away objects get from the camera or from the viewpoint or the viewer, the closer they get to the atmospheric color. So if we have a light blue sky, close objects will have very little of that blue in it. And then as they get further and further away, the natural haze from the density of the air will gradually reduce the contrast of that object and push its value closer to the lightness of the sky and also add more blue into it. This rule is something I definitely follow, but it's very important to remember that objects can be different colors and have different values. And I used to fall into the trap of as all objects got further and further away, no matter what color they were, I always tried to make sure they were a lighter value than some of the mid-ground objects and things like that. And if you notice in some of the trees, there's some light trees, there's some really dark trees, and then there's light trees again. The conventional wisdom that I had, I would have gone, the very foreground trees would have been really dark, and it would have gotten progressively lighter as it went back into the woods, unless it was a dark forest and they get progressively darker. The thing about this is it can create a very uninteresting scene that has no contrast. It's very predictable. So, and it's also important to remember that in a forest, there are trees that are literally white. There's some trees that are almost black. So it's nice to have that variation of light and darks. This method that I'm using with these layer masks is a really good method if you don't know these rules by heart and you're not really sure about them, which I never am. And I don't necessarily apply things correctly. So it's really important for me to have tools that I can experiment with until I get the image right and get the feeling I'm going for. For me, it's not about having an exact replica of what it's supposed to look like. It's just about it feeling right. I think there's a big difference between something feeling right and something being drawn correctly. You can draw something really well and render it quite precisely, but the feeling might not be there. And I think some of the greatest works of art I've seen have been simplistic and more suggestive than absolute in their representation of what they're communicating. Here I'm just blocking in Rocket Randy, his silhouette. I was originally going to have him holding a little control to that he was pressing a button so that he would blast off, but I ended up moving away from that in the final image. As you can probably see, it's very phallic. I didn't really notice it when I drew it, but other people around me have commented, so I got rid of it. The next stage is to start creating some brushes, and these compositions I usually start at about 400 by 400. That's for more detailed brushes. And what I'm doing is I've got the freehand selection tool and I'm just drawing a leafy bushy shape. And then I create a solid color mask right there. So it's just an adjustment color layer with a mask on it. And then I start erasing off the mask, making sure I'm using a brush with no transfer settings because I want these edges to be really hard and opaque right now. And then now once I've done that, I have to rasterize that layer so that it's a solid. And then I can go up to the edit and define brush preset, and that will take that shape and create a brush out of it. And as you can see, the brush is very rudimentary at first, so I need to adjust some of the brush settings. I've created a new layer and I'm just turning on some of the dynamics here, which is creating a little bit of randomness with the shapes and the brush. So I'm just adjusting it until I'm getting a look that I'm okay with, just to create a sense of variation in the edges and lines in the actual silhouettes that I'm working with. So now what I can do is start painting right onto the alpha mask layer and start getting rid of or changing the silhouette in the foliage. And you can see how effective that is right off the bat. And here I'm just using other brushes that I've created in the past using exactly the same technique. It's really simple. And again, they're really opaque. And the reason for them being so opaque is because I eventually use them as containers to hold textures in later. So I want to be able to put paper textures and things like that in them. So it's really important that they be quite opaque. And I've got a whole bunch of brushes that I'm just zipping through as quickly as possible, experimenting, trying to get a better sense of the forest. And I'll include all these brushes. I'll upload them for you guys to download. A lot of them, I think all of them I've made myself. I don't think any of them are downloaded from anywhere. So in here, I'm just trying to create an interesting shape with the foliage and just trying to create some unique shapes so it doesn't look like a tiled pattern. And I find that when I'm drawing foliage without looking at anything for reference, I have a tendency to make really repeated patterns, but just unconsciously. Here I'm creating an all new brush, which I'm going to use to create the leaves or the droopy leaves on the trees. So I'm just drawing something in. This is like, I'm drawing right from scratch, right on top of a color mask. It takes a bit of practice to figure out what kind of shapes make okay brushes. There's certain types of things that just don't work. This one looks like it might not work actually, but it does end up working okay, but not as easily as it could. So there are very particular shapes that really lend themselves well to tiling and being brushes. Also, if you want to do a roundness jitter and you find the direction of the roundness jitter isn't to your liking, you can just rotate the canvas, recapture the brush, and reuse the roundness jitter. So the roundness jitter can affect the length of these leafy patterns, or it can affect the width of them, but I have to flip the brush to make it happen that way. So as you can see, I'm just experimenting with the settings. It takes me quite a while to actually get the look that I want, and I'm using the dynamic direction. So whatever the direction the stroke is going, the brush follows. I'm just trying to adjust the angle until I get the look I like. So it takes a little bit of playing around with. I strongly recommend going through the brush settings and really experimenting with them and playing with them because they're very powerful, huge time savers. If I had to create that silhouette by hand, it would have taken a long time. So here I'm just adjusting the rest of the foliage up close, just adding some detail into it, changing the shape. I created some hard edges in there too because they're sort of like rocks. The other thing I'm doing is I'm finding that the canvas texture is too distracting. So I'm creating my own paper texture here that from a piece of cardboard paper that I scanned. And I'm just making a nice big one. I can see the shapes better, and I still want a texture to work with because it makes it more interesting to be painting on instead of just a gray and white background. So in here, I'm just using some grass brushes. As you can see, I'm just pulling in some grass there. And these are all these little grass brushes I made. I think one or two of them might be the ones that came with Photoshop, but most of them are ones that I made. So I think I have about 3 or 4 different grass brushes I'm using. And then this is the next layer. So another layer, and I've just added a new one because I feel like I need a little more depth in there and a little more to work with. So I'm just going through putting some long grasses, some low grasses, putting in some sticks and branches, and just filling that up and creating a nice random shape or silhouette. The other nice thing about working in this way is that you can stop whenever you want. And as you can see, even from this drawing right here, there's something that's really quite workable and usable as a background here already, and doesn't really have to go into a whole bunch more details. So you can get a sense of a style that's happening even without there being much painterly brushstrokes or anything like that. It does have a pretty strong silhouette. Sort of reminds me of Limbo a little bit, just more complicated. More skilled painters may actually find working this way really counterintuitive. I work here with Ava on Nanorlook, and she likes to paint backgrounds all at once because she's a really strong sense of color. She really understands what the brushes are doing. She understands blending really well. And for someone like me who doesn't understand that stuff, working that way is very difficult. But for her, working this way is difficult. So it really depends what kind of artist you are, what kind of painter you are, or aren't. So at this point, I'm pretty happy with everything that's going on in the image. I have most of the elements put in there. I have a lot of details in there. I've really figured out the style of the at least of the silhouettes and almost I think the flavor of texture I kind of want for this thing. I think the one thing that's really not working as an image is that it's very left heavy. But that doesn't really matter because when we actually do the finished shot, we're going to be panning along the trees and coming to see Rocket Randy. So what I've decided to do at this point is actually take the background further and start pushing it towards a piece of production art that I can actually use for a background in After Effects. This is a very quick transition because I've already been building it in layers. So now I can actually just start fleshing it out. So you'll see me going in there and actually extending pieces that weren't there before, and there's going to be a lot of work that I have to do in parts that you don't even see because as the camera moves, that will reveal different parts of the background that in a still would never be seen. So in this phase, I'm starting to turn on and off layers to get a sense of what's missing. Right now, I feel like there's something missing in this scene, so I'm adding some extra trees. I'm kind of looking for a way to flesh that forest out a little bit and just give it a few different directions of lines because everything's so vertical. So I'm just adding some elements to it and I'm extending some of these pieces. I just need to add a little more variety. Now the plan in my head for this shot is that we'll be moving through the trees along the bottom of the trees, following up to the crest where Rocket Randy's standing. So I want quite a bit of depth in those trees. At this point, I'm pretty happy with the trees, and I'm going to focus my attention on the landscape that's in the distance that moves towards the city, and just adding a little bit more variety to the silhouettes of those hills, giving them almost a sense that there might be bushes on them, or maybe those are distant trees. I was just using the bushel brush that we'd made earlier to do all this foreground foliage. It's the same brush, just really scaled down. So they're quite versatile. And at this point, I'm moving into the city to flesh it out and clean it up a little bit because those shapes that were there were really just meant to be loose. And now I want to tighten it up and give it a little bit more structure. I don't want it to be so marker looking. I want it to have a little bit more hard edges. I am sort of thinking of perspective as I draw these buildings, but they're at every angle. There's not really a specific one set angle that they're at. But I am aware of it. I should note too that I'm using a combination of the polygonal lasso tool and just a really hard eraser to do this. And I'm just working on the color adjustment layer. I'm working on the layer mask for that. The whole goal here is to make the city look interesting, to make the silhouette look interesting. And what's about to happen here is I make one giant blob. So now what I want to do is after I create this other piece on the left, I'm going to want to start cutting into that blob to break it up a little bit. I really don't want big solid blobs. I want it to look deep and look like there's a lot going on, but I don't want to have to make a trillion layers to do that. So it's really important that you have really interesting silhouettes, or at least that I have interesting silhouettes. Now I'm working on some windows. I created these window brushes before using pretty much the same techniques, and then I'm just throwing in a new layer. I created a new layer that's a bright layer. I actually used this brush in the carbon dioxide animations for all of the cities. It's really versatile. It's actually only 3 dots that are just sort of spaced apart, and then I'm just using the dynamics to flip them. There's not even any size dynamics or anything happening on them, so they're pretty basic. The next step here is to actually start creating a sky, because right now the sky is just one solid color. So I create a gradient, and I'm still at this point going for this is a value sketch, so it's really just focusing on lights and darks. A lot of my choices that I'm making while I paint this picture really come from just feeling the image and whether or not it feels right or feels out of balance. So I'm kind of going back and forth, just figuring out what I think I need. The neat thing is about this technique is when you bring it into After Effects and you have all the layers working together, you can start moving them again, and so you have another crack at organizing and laying out the scene. I'm just trying to flesh out this foliage in the top and make it look more interesting because there really isn't. There's only one layer of foliage at this point, and I feel like I need to spice it up a little bit, and create some more dynamic shapes. By using a combination of just, I think it's only about three or four brushes I'm using. By using that combination, I really have a ton of versatility in the type of foliage I create. It makes it pretty fast and pretty easy to make really complex and interesting leaf patterns. These are kind of like Bob Ross brushes a little bit. So here I'm just adding more to the shapes, adding and subtracting from them, trying to get the form a little more interesting, trying to get a nice silhouette out of it. A lot of this will be hidden by the other objects and layers, but it doesn't actually matter because when the camera's moving, a lot of this stuff will be exposed. I'm just adding a new layer here. I've created a new color layer, and now I'm just painting into it with either the eraser or the brush. It really doesn't matter. Just making sure that my opacity is at 100% and that there's not really any fall off on the transfer mode. So at this point, the image is looking pretty solid. I'm pretty happy with the values. And because I might use this for a production plate, I'm going to start refining the outline a little more. So I'm going to go in with a small brush with a rough edge on it and just start painting in all along the edges, because right now they're really sharp and clean because I just used the freehand lasso tool. to actually make those shapes. So they're really digital looking. So at this point, I'm just going in and cleaning up the edges, or not cleaning them up, actually making them dirtier and rougher, just trying to get a little bit more of an organic look to them. And meanwhile, refining the silhouettes to, again, make them more interesting and a little more natural looking. I'm just going through each layer here and just adding a little bit more to them. Lots of back and forth, adding something, taking it back away, undoing, redoing. Wherever I can see something can be improved, I'm just adding to it. Because you never know what layers you're actually going to see when the camera moves. Once there's a lot of depth in there, it'll reveal a lot more than you think. So it's nice to really cover your bases. And here I've just got everything turned on so I can see in context a little better what's actually happening here. The nice thing about switching back and forth so much is sometimes I'll see something that I didn't really plan on. Like I realize that maybe I have too many trees, or maybe there's too much chaos going on in there, and that actually by turning off a layer, the image feels better. And so sometimes, I mean, it's hard to take sometimes because you put so much work into a layer, but it can really be a very important process of exploring the image. Okay, at this stage, I'd say the image is pretty solid, and I've just saved out a flattened version so that I can reference it. And now I'm going to start playing with the foundation color for the image. So I grabbed this picture here off of Tumblr. I'm not sure who the artist is. I can't remember. I grabbed it so long ago. And if you do know the artist, please let me know and I can give them proper credit in this piece. But I really liked the coloring in this piece. And not to say that I'll actually get this coloring while I'm in this concept stage, but I'm going to try for it and see if it actually works. Now what I'm doing here is adding a color gradient to the very base of the image. So I'm going to go through and start manipulating all of the different grays layers, because right now they are all different shades of gray, and I'm going to start converting them to colors, like solid colors and gradients. And I've changed the overlay layer, but which before the blending mode was color burn, and now I just put it to normal. I think I put it to normal. Either put it to normal or color. I'm pretty sure it's set to normal. And now what I can do is just start adjusting the color of each layer and trying to find the image, like trying to find the feeling for the image. This is a pretty long process for me because I'm not a really strong painter. I don't have a great sense of color, so it takes me a long time to experiment. And I think that's why this method works so well for me, because I can really play with it, go back and forth, adjusting every single layer until I get the look I'm going for. Okay, so here is the first color set that I actually ended up liking. And I got to this by changing the colors constantly and moving back and forth on them. And I ended up, instead of just using solid colors, using a lot of gradients on this image. So where in the last little piece you saw me just using each one was a solid color, I actually went back in and replaced those with gradient maps. And that sort of creates this moving from, let's say, like a warmer base in the tree and then moving up into the cools. And this is something that can be really, really effective. But I start with solid colors first, and then I try the gradients. And it's just using the adjustment layers. So then after that, I did a few experiments with color correcting it and trying to get it a little bit closer to that original image that we were looking at, that photograph. And I think this is a little closer. It's still maybe too contrasty, maybe it's a bit too dark, but I'm going to keep this as a reference, because even if I really skew away from these colors, I can always come back to it. But I really do like the feeling of this. The image I ultimately end up with is a lot brighter and a lot warmer, but I could always come back to these really nice cools and stuff like that later. So I didn't get to see the whole process of going through and recoloring the image because I lost a lot of the clips in the video capture software. So We're going to move into the process of building up Rocket Randy in the concept art. This isn't 100% necessary because I actually already have a puppet done of him, and he's not going to look this realistic in the actual finished animation. So it's a little bit misleading. However, I wanted to do it just to get a better sense of him, to play with it a little bit, just in case, I decided to go more realistic with him. But that's definitely not in the spirit of the piece. It's to be the characters, I want to feel a little bit tacked in there, like he's a piece of paper coming to life. But I thought this would be fun to sort of experiment with the mood and the atmosphere of the piece and kind of reinvent Rocket Randy again to create some nice concept art. I'm still really working with solid color layers at this point, even though I've done these really fine sketches over top. The solid color layer that I'm using with the adjustment layer and the layer mask is going to be very powerful to me because I can contain all my coloring inside of it, like a folder. I can make a folder with that alpha matte on top of it, so that it allows me to paint really fast and really messy inside that folder and not go outside of the edges. So it's a way I really like to work, and you can see I'm doing this for the Rocket Pack 2 as I've created a color adjustment layer with an alpha mask and put the Rocket Pack in there, so I can really paint in there and draw really fast and messy, and it'll still retain the sharpness of the shape. So here I'm just going in and refining some details, trying to find the shape of the character more, the sleeves, and just getting a better resolution and sense of the clothing and everything like that. And it's a pretty long process. I also found he was standing too straight and tall. If you look at the artwork on the right hand side, his neck really comes forward a bit more like a vulture. So I'm just readjusting that. And I'm doing it in a really digital way by cutting the whole head off, moving it over, and just sort of reconnecting it and painting it. Here I'm just adding in more fine line details. I've taken the sketch that I've done and reduced it down to 25%, created a new layer, and I'm just drawing on top of it. Some lines I do many, many, many times over. I wish I could just do them once and love them, but oftentimes I'll do one line and undo it and do one again. There's something about drawing on the computer that it doesn't seem as accurate as when I draw with a pen on paper, or maybe I'm just not worried about it that much when I'm on drawing with paper because I never draw a line and erase it 10 times on paper. I just draw the line. But for some reason in the computer, even if I'm drawing on a tablet display, I oftentimes don't like the line I make and I have to undo it multiple times until I get it right. It really could just be a symptom of the digital world where you just have so many options that you never let anything go, or I never let anything go. And there's other artists that are really great at just drawing and moving quickly, but that's definitely not me. Not yet, anyway. One day. Here I'm just adjusting the alpha matte or alpha mask. I'm not really sure what it's called exactly, so forgive me if my terminology fluctuates a lot. I'm just adjusting it. As I refine the lines and start discovering this character better, I'll go back in and sometimes clean up the alpha layer a little bit just so that I have a really good sense of the volume and the mass of the character. 'Cause sometimes looking at the slightly smaller color mask layer with the lines around it just sort of sends my brain for a loop and it kind of makes me a little impatient. I think that this stage of drawing for me is one of the funnest. It's sort of inventing and discovering the character, cross hatching, moving really quickly. I really, really enjoy this stage. So it is fairly fast. Even though I have this sped up tremendously, I'm still moving for me pretty quickly. At this point, I'm just fleshing out some of the details, kind of my shading. This will be really helpful when I actually start painting in my colors and my lights and darks. I like having some cross hatching because I am going for sort of a pen and ink look. And this is helping me define the volumes and the masses a little more, the character. So now I'm moving into figuring out this rocket pack. I am referencing the image on the right a lot, just kind of looking at it, trying to get a better sense of the structure, because when I made the actual shape, I moved quite quickly and wasn't really paying attention to the details. I find the inside of the rocket engine a little bit tricky to get. And these lines along the side are also really tricky because those seams really define the form of the rocket engine. And I find getting the curve just right on them was a little hard. I had to redraw that line a ton. There is also some perspective happening on the rocket pack where it's just 1 point perspective, where the engine that's closest to us is slightly larger than the engine behind, and same thing goes with the fin. It may be a bit exaggerated, but at the time it felt right. I think looking at it now, I think that fin furthest from the camera or on the left-hand side is a little bit too small, but that doesn't really matter. I'm just fleshing in some of the details. Now I'm doing the cross hatching, and this is just, again, helping me define the volumes and the masses of this and maintaining that really pen and ink look that I'm going for. Through most of the drawing process, I'm thinking about the lighting. Not so much when I do the initial lines, or the outlines, but right now I'm really thinking about the light. I'm always considering where the key light is, so that would be like the sun, and then I'm considering the sky or the ambient light, which would be everything facing upwards will be brighter than everything facing down because of all the light that's bouncing around in the sky. And then if he was standing on a really bright white surface, there'd be like a lot of light bouncing up. So I've always got this going on in my head, and I'm always trying to wrap my head around where the most light would be, where the least amount of light would be. And the thing about drawing is everything where two surfaces meet, it's the darkest. But I really struggle with lighting. Lighting is really tricky for me. And as you'll see, I'll go through this process, and I'm going to try so many things and really struggle because it's really hard sometimes for me to understand where the light would be hitting a surface, and you really have to understand the form of something to know where the most light will be hitting. And obviously the brightest side of this character will be away from the camera because it's coming from the sunlight, but we're going to get some really bright light wrapping around the character ever so slightly to create some rim lighting. And I've added in his helmet there, you can see there's sort of a bluish color, and that's coming from the sky. So I'm considering that reflective, or that ambient light coming from the sky, and then losing a bit of it because he's underneath the trees. So it's more to the front of his helmet. And then you can see along the very front of his helmet and along the bottom and stuff like that, it's got more of the yellow from the sun. I actually found painting this rocket pack really tricky because it's supposed to be slightly reflective. So I'm trying to figure out what's around him and how things would reflect in this cylinder. If you ever look at a picture of those milk trucks that I think they carry dairy, and they're just bright silver, and they reflect everything. It's really interesting to see what happens to things when they're distorted in a cylinder. And so I'm trying to think of this as I'm drawing it, and I find it really difficult. And I actually ended up finding that to be more aggressive was better. Like at first I was starting out with very translucent brushes at like 10% and going over and over again. And I found increasing that and just being more aggressive with them made a more believable image. But it did take me a long time to get it right. And I don't think I ever really got it right. You can also see, I think at this stage, is I've all fixed that one fin that was furthest away from the camera. I've darkened them up, and I've added a little lightness along the top ridge of the fin where they're facing towards the sky. And then here I'm just kind of working on the reflection of the fin. I always struggle a little bit with reflections too, because I'm not really sure the shift that happens on them, because the reflection is tints the color based on the color of the metal, and it's all this stuff you need to think about. And it helps if you're looking at something, but there's really nothing I could find to mimic this scenario or these colors, at least not in the studio while I was working. Here I'm just painting in the cushion, the padding that essentially is on the rocket pack, and these other elements, these browns on him. I'm just painting in a solid brown right now, just like if you took like a brown crayon, and then I go over and start cooling it off based on the fact that I have really warm highlights, so my shadows are going to be really cool, like more in the blues and the purples, and the cool purples. And I'm working with tons of layers. Every time I start a new kind of thing, or if I'm sort of happy with what I've done, I create a new layer. I'm not a very confident painter, so I do bounce around a lot, and I am really nervous about ruining something. And there's always a point in every image I work on. There's a point where I think it's absolute garbage, and I'm really getting discouraged about it. But I usually just push through. And oftentimes I think, like a finished image that isn't that good is better than a million unfinished images. But that's not always the case. I mean, sometimes it's okay to have really a lot of unfinished work. But now in here, I'm just adding more reflections and really strong highlights. I usually add those in last as I come back in. I find it really fun to go in and really push the highlights around. And usually I use an overlay layer for that. So as you can see, I'm brightening up the edge of his helmet. I'm trying to come in with some really nice brights and getting some really just some keys and key lights and some highlights in there. Bring a little more contrast into the character. And here I'm just playing with some of the textures on everything. The goal with these textures on top is to make it so that they don't affect the value of the overall composition. So when you have a paper texture on top, I'm trying not to, you adjust the gray value until it's about 50%. So it doesn't, when you do an overlay pass, it doesn't change everything. Now, at this stage, I started the really tedious process of taking all of my layers and converting them to gradients. Because what I had done is I'd put an overlay on top that created an overall gradient for the whole image, and I needed to get that back. So I had to go back through manually and recreate gradients out of my solid colors, which it all started out as solid greens and browns and all that kind of stuff. So I had to go back through and sample the one color I was working with and create all these new layers. So I'm creating new adjustment layers that are gradients, and then control clicking on the alpha matte to get a mask selection and then applying that to my gradient. Now, the thing about gradients, the way they work is they scale based on the area of your selection mask. So if your selection mask only covers half the screen, then your gradient is going to go, let's say, from black to white in half the distance of the screen. If you increase the layer mask on it all the way to the entire height of the screen, then at the very bottom of the screen, it'll be black, and at the top, it'll be white. So I just want to quickly discuss what I'm doing here. I'm taking all of the layer masks that I made with the gradients on them and creating a new empty folder, and then dragging the layer mask to the top of that folder, like so essentially the folder has a layer mask on it, and then the gradient is just sitting there, so it fills up the whole screen. Like we lose the light and dark of the gradient because it becomes from the bottom of the screen to the top. So then I'm creating a new layer mask that's just a box to contain that gradient so that it goes from the dark value to the light value in the space that I want it to. The reason I'm doing this, the reason I'm creating these folders with the alpha matte on them is so that I can put textures inside of them and still keep the color that I came up with earlier. It's a bit of a tedious process. If I had planned on using this as production art, I probably would have done this a little bit earlier. Okay, so I've slowed this down to normal speed. I'm going to show you this process in real time. Okay, so I've got this layer with a mask on it and a gradient. I've just created a new group folder just by pressing Control G on the layer. And then I dragged the layer mask up so it's on top of the folder. And now what I'm doing is I've selected it and I'm creating a mask I'm creating a selection mask that's the same size as the layer and then applying that to the color gradient. And what this does is this contains the gradient inside of that box, sort of like what I was talking about earlier, so that the one value of the gradient, so the gradient value on the left and the gradient value on the right, is all contained within that alpha mask. If I don't do that, my light colors at the top of the screen and my dark colors at the bottom, and that's not the way I want it to work. Okay, so at this stage, I've finished putting all of those gradients in the folders and readjusting them. So, and I was just turning it on and off to make sure that I didn't lose anything or miss anything. So now what I have is I have a whole bunch of folders with masks on them. So I can paint inside of those. And like you're seeing here, I'm adding some highlights to those tree shapes, to the foliage there. And I can paint in that, do all sorts of stuff to it. Now that it's a group folder, I can add new layers, I can add textures to it, I can do all kinds of things, and it'll stay within the shape of the layer that I have. So whether it's the tree or the branches or the ground layers. So I can do all kinds of stuff, and it's really fun at this stage because I can really start adding some details to everything. So now what I'm finding here is that my colors aren't quite working. So I'm going in and adjusting the gradients in all of these ground objects. I just wasn't liking what color they were. You can do this essentially two different ways. Is you can adjust the gradient itself, the color gradient, or you can add like a new color overlay layer or a new adjustment layer that's a color and just push that around and use like a different blending mode to push the color around. Or you can just paint inside of it. But I'm just adjusting these colors a bit. I'm not finding all of them are working. And the other thing I wanted to do is add more of a shift from the cools to the warms, which are more in the middle, and then really kind of cooling them off into blues as we get really down into the underground or to the bottom area. Just created a nicer looking shape. So after I've finished that, I've took a whole bunch of pictures. Well, I scanned a bunch of cotton that I stretched out to look like clouds. And here I'm just using the color selection tool to clear that green off. And this is using the refine mask tool. I'm not going to get into how to use it, but I strongly recommend playing with it because it's a pretty good keyer. So once I've cut them out, I'm going to experiment here because I don't really know how I'm going to do the clouds. I know that I want to use cotton, but I'm not really sure how the look is going to work. So what I've done is I've created a folder with a layer mask using the cloud as a selection mask. So just control clicking on it, you can use it as a selection mask. And I'm painting inside of that folder. So I've created new layers and I'm painting on top of it and trying to manipulate it so that it looks like what I want. Lots and lots of experimentation. Again, I'm working with a lot of layers and layer masks. Layer masks are really, really powerful because like I said, I can contain what my brushes are doing inside of the shape of that object. Here I'm playing with some drop shadow filters. I was trying to figure out if I wanted the clouds to look like they were stuck on a backdrop and that they were casting a shadow upwards, but I decided ultimately not to do that. In the latest version of Photoshop, you can actually apply effects layers to folders or groups. You couldn't do that in previous versions. You could only do it to layers. So now what I'm doing here is I'm loading up a whole bunch of paper textures, and I'm going to start copying and pasting them and dropping them in to the scene to try to figure out what kind of textures I can use to add a little more life to this thing. And I'm going to be experimenting a lot. I'll be doing one layer at a time, and I've decided I want to use this corrugated paper. Like these papers, I actually went to a paper store and bought a sample pack and then just scanned them all at really high resolution. And I really like what it's doing for the ground there. I actually used some of these textures for the pipelines animation. Now what I'm doing here is I'm actually creating a new layer on top that I use to create my layer effects. I didn't realize at the time that you could just apply layer effects to a group or to a folder. So what I used to do before you could do this in Photoshop is I would create a new layer, just use the alpha mask on the group layer, control click the thumbnail of the alpha mask, create a new layer, and then put the fill to 0, and then add all sorts of filters to it. And then that way you can really kind of get the look you want to go for. And I'm doing this because I'm trying to establish a bit of a thick paper layered look. And I mean, you could really save that step to last, but I want to have the whole feeling as I go. And then all you have to do is, copy and paste the layer style just by right clicking on the effects. You can copy the layer style and then you can just paste it on however many layers you want. So I'm just adding this texture to every single ground layer. As far as the buildings and stuff, I just end up leaving them, and I'm just using that paper texture over top of everything. I don't actually go in. I have to fix that later, and we'll get into that later. Here I'm just painting in some rough shadows, because again, this is concept art. If I knew I was going to bring this directly into After Effects, I wouldn't bother painting all these shadows in, because I would just set up a light and cast them. But here, I'm trying to convey the feeling of what I want the finished image or the composition in After Effects to do. Now here I'm adding a bevel effect to the actual lights. So it looks like there's holes punched into the building itself. So I'm putting an outer bevel on it and then indenting it and making sure that I'm keeping in mind my light source being the sky above and the sun. In the end, I actually take the layer effects off because they're very processor intensive, and I try to use After Effects in effects like bevels and everything like that in After Effects. When you use layer styles, they can really slow down the rendering speed. So you really have to be careful how much you use them. I did a project with a holiday train project, and you can watch it on my Vimeo or YouTube page. And it was the longest render times I've ever worked with because I used so many layer styles. Now here I'm creating an atmosphere layer. I started adding it and playing with it because I'm trying to find a way to push those buildings back a little bit. So one way that you can do this is you can create a sky gradient essentially, and I set its transparency way down to like 5%, and I just start duplicating it in between my buildings. Instead of adjusting the lightness value of every single layer, I just start duplicating like an overall sky gradient and layering it on top of each layer, and that gradually pushes everything back. So in front of the very far back buildings, I'll put the sky gradient, and then in the next layer of buildings, I'll put another sky gradient on top of it, and gradually decrease the opacity as it goes up. Here I'm just adjusting the color and everything like that so it looks right. I ended up not doing a whole sky gradient, and I just did sort of a haze, like a ground haze. And when I actually get into After Effects, I just duplicate this process by creating adjustment layers. Like I don't use the actual original gradient, which you'll see. We'll get into that later. And here I'm just painting some blooms in, because when we actually, again, get into After Effects, there'll be some glow layers and effects on everything. So it'll do all this automatically, so you won't have to do this. But again, the goal is to establish the look here. I'm not being too precise, but I'm just trying to get the vibe down. All right, so I'm pretty happy with what's going on here. I mean, it's not completely as bright as it needs to be. It needs some work, but what I'm going to do now is just start playing with adding some more clouds, which I magically do really fast here. I did the clouds all the same way as I did that first cloud. I just cut out different ones and sort of placed them and layered them together. So as you can see, the sky is kind of under control. The far background is under control. Now the next big step is actually going to be texturing the rest of the scene. And what I'm doing here is I've actually decided to use this as my production art for the real background. So I'm removing the foliage of the top of that tree off that layer. So I've duplicated the whole layer out, and I'm just erasing this off, and then I'll recreate the foliage on top and just remove all of the tree element from it and the ground. And I also want to separate the grounds from all the trunks of the trees. The reason I'm doing this is so that I can create lots and lots of depth and even add some movement to the foliage when with some deformers and things like that. So I need to separate everything. It's a bit tedious. Obviously, if I was doing this any other way, maybe I would have kept everything separate, but it's not a huge problem to go in and just clear everything off and just using the same brushes, just add some new texture to it. And so now I can change the color of the trunk of the tree and give it a little more of its own flavor and do the same thing with the foliage. As you see, I've pushed one more to green and I've changed the values a little bit. And then what I can do in After Effects is really layer them. I can have a ground layer, I can have a tree trunk layer, and then I can have the foliage on top of that, but further forward. And you'll see that we get a lot more depth that way. So I do that to all of the layers that I left connected to give myself as much control as possible. Like I didn't go through and separate every single tree trunk though. On my different tree layers, I didn't go and do that. I didn't go that crazy with it. So the next big step here is to try to figure out how I'm going to texture the trees, the trunks, the foliage, and stuff like that. And I'm just not sure at this point. And so I have a huge image library of stuff that I've scanned, things that I've painted, and I go through it all and bring it in and experiment with it. I experiment with different overlay properties, different blending modes. I try changing the colors a little bit. Again, it's really important to, if you are going to use an object to overlay and you like your colors, that you get that layer so that its values are, first of all, it's desaturated, and secondly, its actual value, you want it to be roughly 50%. So if you squint your eyes and you have a 50% gray color beside that texture, it should be roughly the same tone, and that will keep that texture image from darkening or lightening your color that it's sitting on top of. Here I'm experimenting with some more dramatic type textures. I actually found that I moved away from this and just started using some really painterly textures. It just worked a lot better for some reason. In the actual pipelines video, I used some really, really specific textures that were definitely paper. And I find it worked a lot better for that style. For this one, I feel like the more naturalistic approach seems to work a bit better. The cool thing is with this is I'm working it again in folders, so I can add as many textures as I want. So I've taken this really dry brushed scumbled canvas texture, and then I've added a new one which has more of a torn surface, and that used like multiple layers with tape and then ripping it off, and that's created this tree trunk. And I can also play with those values of them, so like darken them, lighten them, until I get the contrast that I want out of that structure. You can just move them around like a big giant piece. One problem with working this way is that the images get quite large. You might end up having to save it as a PSB. I don't know if any of you guys have gotten to that point yet where you have an image, it's a PSD, and then all of a sudden it's over 2 gig and you have to save it as a PSB file. Here I'm just separating these trees off of that ground piece again, like I did with the foreground tree, just so that again I can use them as a different layer. And I also want to control their color a little bit more because I don't want them to be the same color as the ground because they're not that far away. They're still fairly close. The nice thing is too, by doing this, you can reuse those ground pieces as foliage. You can use them as foreground elements and everything like that because and there's not a whole bunch of trees on them. Here I'm just cleaning this up a little bit more. Now I'm just trying to pick the color for the trees and just cooling them off a bit. And now I'm just adding the texture. And this is one of the textures that was acrylic paints on canvas. And this is another set of trees I need to separate. So I'm just chopping them off. And remember, I'm duplicating the groups. Like I'm duplicating the entire group and then painting all this stuff in only on the alpha mask, not on anything else, the alpha matte. And then I'm deleting the trees off the duplicate and then just painting in some ground foliage and details. And now I can change the color of the trunks and add some texture to it. It's really not this fast, obviously. It's a much slower process than this, but so here I'm just going through and renaming things. I am also adding I think I'm adding some effects to all of these as well. Just adding a bevel to them all so that they look a little more cut out. And again, I'm going to do this bevel in After Effects, so I'm not going to be doing this the way I did it here. And also remember, I'm creating these duplicate layers and then applying the effect to them and then setting their fill to 0. That's not necessary. You can apply layer effects to groups. You don't have to do it the way I did it anymore. Now, the one thing I haven't tackled yet is the actual foliage and these bushes in the front. And I started out by trying to use a whole bunch of different textures, and I couldn't really find anything that quite worked for a while. So what I decided to do is just paint something new. But of course, before I got to that point, I had to try a whole bunch of different textures. And when I threw this blue in, I actually liked what it did to the color of the trees, so of the foliage. So what I ended up doing is creating some color layers, just a color adjustment layers, on top of some pre-existing textures, and actually using it to push the colors. It can be a really good way to work. So there, I've just created a color layer and shifted the color. So now it's more of a purpley pinkish color. And I'm trying to get the colors a little more interesting in here and trying to break up some of the shapes a little bit. At this point, I'm still going through and trying so many different things on these bushes, trying to find ways to make them look more interesting. I even scanned this crumpled up paper and tried to get that in there and see how it would look. And sometimes it really takes getting something to a fairly complete level before I realize it doesn't work. I tried it on the foliage at the top, I tried it on the bushes in the front, I tried it on all of them at the same time, and it just wasn't really working. So it was here that I actually decided to use an ink texture, like a couple of ink washes, and I dropped it in on some of these ground layers, and I actually found it started giving me more of the look I wanted. And this is a technique I used more for the carbon dioxide animation. These ones are newer because I used some older ones for that one, but these are just black ink on watercolor paper with some sea salt and stuff thrown on it to create some of that texture. And now I'm layering them together. I'm not just using one. I'm kind of stacking them to try to get the look that I like. And what I'm really focusing on in this is trying to get some interesting light and dark points that are suggestive of what's going on the ground here. So if there's little dark patches of grass and some light areas, like I'm trying to focus on where my light and darks go. And now I've created these washes here that are like hills, and I'm putting them in on the grassy hills that feel like they needed a little more something to them. So I've thrown that in, and what that's done is it's created a nice wash kind of effect to them. And this is the new one that I made. I painted this specifically for this project. There's more color in that than I normally use, but I actually was really hoping it would help positively influence the textures and colors of the bushes in the front. I tried to make it as contrasty and textured as possible so that would have a lot of options when placing it into the scene. And I actually found that it worked quite nicely, so much so that I actually used it for a lot of the top foliage afterwards. It is affecting the color quite a bit. If I didn't want it to push the colors at all, what I could do is just simply desaturate it, and then I would still have a lot of the texture and contrast without the color shift. And on this one, I actually did a huge shift on that. Okay, so after I had played with the textures and got everything sorted, this is kind of what I ended up with. it's a lot more colorful and bright than the original photograph that I referenced in the beginning. But I do think that I'll be going a little closer back to that later, just pushing the colors back at another time, because right now I like where it got to, but I still think it's not necessarily the mood I'm going for. It's definitely very, very warm. So I think I might like it to be a little bit darker, but that's really hard to say at the moment. So right now I'm just adding extra layers just so I can paint in some of the shadows. These shadows will happen naturally in After Effects once I start adding some of the lights and I enable soft shadows. And I'll just make sure that I position the lights so that I create some really good casts. Oftentimes what happens if you position the lights where you think they should go, you don't necessarily get really nice shadows where you want them. So it's important to sometimes you just use lights even just to cast shadows. There's actually only a couple of steps that really have to be done to get this image into After Effects. And a lot of that would be just deleting these extra shadow layers and removing the layer effects and flattening everything out. But we get into that later. One of the things that I end up doing in the next video that I did before I brought it into After Effects is actually expanding the canvas size even more and giving myself more of the trees to work with, like the foliage to work with, and a lot more of the hills and everything. So I ended up expanding everything a lot. I should have thought of that initially. I didn't really plan on bringing this to such a resolved level, but as soon as I started adding the textures, it would have been a good time to expand the composition at that point, knowing that I wanted to use it for production. And the reason you'd want to expand it is I'm not really 100% sure what the camera move is going to be on this shot. Like, am I going to come down from the sky? Am I going to come over from the city and come over to him? Like, I'm not really sure what's going to happen. And because of that, I need to have a lot to work with. So I usually treat these kind of things like little doll sets or puppet sets that I can then position my camera in later to try to get the shot I'm looking for. So here I'm just doing a lot of detail work and just polishing it off. This is overly resolved, but this would be something that I would present to a client to really give them the idea of what I was trying to do. It's about a day of work to put something together like this, and it can be really, really, really powerful to present the overall goal of where we're trying to go with this project. It's showing them what the backgrounds look like, what the level of detail in the whole film will be, kind of a lighting treatment, basically an overall. The only thing I wouldn't necessarily do is have the Rocket Randee in there quite so resolved. Probably would put him in there as the paper puppet if I were to be showing that to a client. Because if you show them something like the resolved Rocket Randee where he's all shaded and everything, and they really like him like that, you're going to have to go back in and redesign a lot of the puppet and have to repaint a lot of the pieces, and that would be a silly thing to have to do. So here's the finished artwork as is, and with some color correction put on it, attempting to match a little closer that image, that photograph that I downloaded. And as you can see, it's not bang on, but it's getting closer, and I think there's more that could be done. I think the biggest offender here is these really strong purples that aren't really present in this scene at all. And the sky is definitely more of a reddish color. It has a lot more red and blue in it and yellow. The sky in here is more of a greenish color, but that's not really, doesn't really matter because we're looking at more of a sunset scene. But this can be adjusted in After Effects. We can continue to play with it. And everything I did to adjust the colors here is something that we have a filter for in After Effects. So I'm not doing anything I can't replicate later. And right here, I'm just fading in an alternate color mix. This has a lot less crushed blues, and there's less purple in the background there. Hard to really tell the difference, but this is a warmer version of the same thing. So you have a lot of options. All right, so that's about it. It was a long video. In the next video, I'm going to go through the process of breaking this down for After Effects and then show you how to actually lay it all out and start getting the depth that we want in there. It's really, really fun after this. It's one of my favorite things to do is to take these kind of paintings and bring them into After Effects and start playing with camera moves and the depth and the camera effects and really start bringing everything to life. If you like what e.d.Films is doing and want to stay up to date on the latest developments and tutorials, please show your support by liking us on Facebook.